Um, Once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us again today for this uh, timely discussion. I'm Omar Mohammed, a senior fellow at the program on extremism at George Washington University, and I'm honored to welcome you today into a virtual book talk. We are joined by Professor Craig Whiteside of the U.S. Naval War College, whose forthcoming book, uh, titled Non-State Special Operations, Capabilities and Effects, offers a compelling, deeply researched examination of how violent non-state actors develop and deploy special operation capabilities in modern conflict, something we have seen in the past months and probably years. Uh, Building on years of research, including earlier work on the Islamic State, this book proposes a new theoretical framework and typology of violent non-state actors, from militants and proxies to criminal actors, networks, cults, and mercenaries. Through multiple case studies, Craig explores how these actors execute special operations. Why do they why they do so, and what that tells us about the future of irregular warfare, a very concerning trend that is emerging recently. More than a study of tactics, this book addresses the broader implications of non-state actors who have not only challenged but at times humiliated state militaries, reshaping how we think about strategic surprise, asymmetric power, and global security trends. And this is, in fact, a timely and important discussion. And I'm Greg, very excited to be hosting this talk today. Welcome to this discussion.
Thank you, Omar. It's great to be here. Great to be back with the program on extremism, one of my favorite think tanks on these topics. Worked with you in the past on the ISIS files, which was a great opportunity for me and some of my fellow researchers. And the Mosul podcast that you put together years ago with one of my partners, Haroro Ingram, is still my favorite.
Thank you, Greg. I'm happy to have you here again. Let's talk about your book. The book that you are publishing very soon introduces a new theoretical framework for categorizing violent state actors. Could you probably briefly walk us through this framework and how it differs from existing models?
Sure. Let me share screen here real quick. I'm going to pull up some slides that might help us. Um, we're talking. The book is about non-state special operations, but as you allude to, we kind of start with a framework of what are violent non-state actors, and our interest in creating a typology that helps us in the book is to try to look at variations in different special operations. You mentioned a few in the intro of trends, kind of a troubling trends, but at first we needed to look at there's lots of different types of violent non-state actors, and then how did that impact variations of the operations that they do. So I'm going to just move to some slides here. There we go. One more. All right. This is the typology that we looked at. We looked at two different kind of divisions. One is what the actor motives are, and that allows us to kind of divide up major categories between whether they were politically inclined or whether they were more self-interested. We started with profit-oriented, but changed it to self-interested to include violent cults. So groups that are much more just maximizing their own very parochial small interests, which for criminals it's profit maximization. For cults, it's the ability to live in the way that they want to do, and at the exclusion of others. or the more traditional politically minded militant Islamic State, obviously. But we have an example here of the Viet Cong, um, more along the insurgent lines. The other division we saw was whether actor agency, whether they were independently interested in conducting these types of specialized tactical events, or whether or not they were being directed to by sponsors who kind of provided a lot of the resourcing for that. Resourcing for non-state actors is obviously a critical determinant on whether they're going to actually conduct these kind of operations. The typology, just the reason we kind of had to develop a typology was because it's quite difficult sometimes for these groups. These are ideal types, say, and the groups are obviously on spectrums. So if you look at Islamic State, for example, a group you're very familiar with and have studied and researched and written on, um, it's obviously it's a militant group. It's famously independent, without external sponsors per se developed. As you understand, their own economics to drive their operations. But they can also be confused with a criminal organization, as you saw as well with their ability to co-opt political leaders and bribe them and conduct, a lot of extortion activities that we would understand as more criminal. But the purpose of all that criminal activity is to fund to achieve their political objective. And so we would categorize them in that militant group with high independent agency and very politically minded, even though they do other things like criminal activities, right? And so that's where the typology helped us to kind of start um, to understand special operations better by how they vary amongst different groups.
Um, yeah, I think we continue in that direction. Greg, something in the discussion about your book also talks about the assessment of the capabilities of effects. I mean, the different types, they intersect, sometimes they overlap, but how do you assess the capabilities and effects of these non-state special operations? What is the criteria that we can assess it through which we can assess their capabilities?
Yeah, that was our main contribution, but really, in order of development, it was our second theoretical contribution. That's what is a non-state special operation. Um, it applies to states as well. I mean, we feel like special operations are special operations on how they're defined, but for non-state operations, the differences between states um, is of interest. There's some pushback to the idea of non-state actors doing special operations. In fact, it's almost unheard of. Many of the examples that we have in the book, the cases, some of the examples I'll talk about in this talk aren't known as special operations. They're just known as these one-off events, right? These very strange events that have happened. But so we wanted to establish this concept. So let me go back to um, here. So thinking about, states conduct special operations, that's well accepted. There's a great amount of literature out there. Um, what we were thinking of is that one, violent non-states are very limited in their resources. They don't, or very infrequently can consolidate or even afford to expend the resourcing on something that's quite extravagant like a special operation. They're usually, very much famously about attacking stronger adversaries when they're not, looking, or when they're vulnerable, and then, fighting, along Maoist principles of, when they're attacking retreat, when they're stationary, or vulnerable attack, those kind of things. So they're quite challenged in there. But what inspired this a little bit is looking at how states develop special operation, or in the more modern era. Certainly, we have examples of special operations that are hundreds of 100 years old, or hundreds of years old. So we don't think they're new to violent non-states. They're just not really thought about in this way. And so we're trying to kind of reconsider that. Um, the but states, the Doolittle raid is a great example of a state actor, the United States, using um, conventional units in unconventional ways. So they used Army bombers on Navy aircraft carriers to attack Japan with no tactical effect really whatsoever, but a strategic effect and really a propaganda effect of we can hit your homeland, and this is a consequence of your attack on Pearl Harbor. And so this is how states have improvised and created ad hoc special operations capabilities, without special operations forces, which is a kind of a distinction we make in the book, and certainly is made in the larger field. And so what we needed to do was to create some kind of criteria, as you mentioned, that would allow us to define what is a non-state special operation and frankly, what isn't. Most operations that violent non-state actors do, the overwhelming majority, 95%, are not special operations, even if they have a large impact. Because, as you know, the logic of terrorism is to create a large political impact with a small group of people. So the logic is similar there, but we distinguish terror acts from special operations, even if some of the special operations examples we have been called terrorism in the past. Let's say 9/11 or the October 7th attack, as you mentioned already. Let me just show you our criteria real quick. Um, these are the reasons why states conduct non-state or special operations, and we feel that non-states have the same motivations: the humiliation of the enemy, an economy of force, but also the development of expanded choice, more choices, more strategic choices for decision makers. That's what special operations does for states, and we argue that that logic holds for non-state actors as well. And then let me see here. I'm going to,
Probably, yeah, probably
yeah,
because you were mentioning something very important, Craig.
yep,
Before we go to the criteria, I mean, you might not have discussed this, but you also talked about the state special operations. The question is like how much of these state operations have become a prototype, for example, for non-state special operations. Like, what is the risk in the development? What are the risks of the development of the state special operations, and what can states do to minimize the risk of these kind of like operations being used against them? Because you mentioned that one of the main goals of the United States special operations, like the humiliation of the state. And we have seen this. We have seen this in some African areas. We have seen this in Afghanistan. We have seen this in October 7. We have seen this 2014 when ISIS took over.
yeah.
Because it's also the question of the narrative, the illusion, the persuasion, and so on. That what states should do in order to avoid falling in this trap.
Yeah. The question of risk is really important. It's why states create special operations. They create them for the reasons that I just mentioned, that come from Colin Gray's early work on why special operations are, how they fit into strategy in the first place. But how it's evolved in the more modern eras is states use special operations to kind of buy down risk. They have very specialized units that do specialized missions that have high impacts, but they're politically reliable. They're you can send a unit into Pakistan to kill Osama bin Laden, and that's going to go without being a debacle or a political problem for the presidential decision maker. That's why states use it. Non-states, that's that's the reason it's much more rare for non-states is they don't have the resources. If they did pool all of their resources for a single operation, it's very risky. It's they can be identified. Some of the special operations that we have in the book cases are failed special operations because states were able to discover them. They're able to use their intelligence to kind of see them ahead of time. This is something that for great a lot of that's driven a lot of questions is how Hamas was able to do this on October 7th, right, with a very capable state intelligence agency facing them. But I'll try to talk about why that is, and it gets to what we've defined as uh, what we call a three tests for what is a non-state special operation. One is that it is high risk and well resourced. So they make a very conscious decision to take their very thin resources, maybe in several of our cases, amass a large number of their best fighters, which is for insurgents or terrorists or any non-state actor, it's a very dangerous thing to do when you're facing capable states. But nonetheless, they do that. Um, it's a specialized military action, so they spend some time planning, intelligence, preparation, rehearsals to achieve some very high level of tactical competence. That it's a departure from their norm
Mhm.
that assists in the surprise factor and the ability to achieve what their the one of the main characteristics of special operations is they normally rely on surprise and the ability to achieve what McGraven calls relative superiority in a very short amount of time. And we see that in these examples. And then finally, they are purposefully intended to create an outsized effect at this operational, but most likely at the political and strategic level. So these are how we applied this test to the different cases, and then looked at different cases in the different categories we talked about up front to try to understand, how to think about a non-state special operation, what it is and what it isn't, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's our three-pronged test. And then alluding to your other question, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, is our hypothesis at that conclusion of the resources that this tactic is very appealing to violent non-state actors if they have the competence and the resources to do it, and that it's increasing. Our hypothesis is, this is a theoretical work, but we invite other researchers to come and look at, from a data perspective, if this is an increasing phenomenon that's a danger to states or other, kind of global institutions.
So on that very specific point, Craig, I mean, it seems that these state actors, be it the terrorist organizations, you mentioned also in the book there are criminal networks. Um, they have seen that it is they have seen some successful special ops. The question is, are these if it's going to become a phenomena, if it's going to become a trend, are they going to have them kind of like small limited special ops, or they might take it to another level on a larger scale, something more sophisticated. But then some might ask, like, this requires resources, requires time, requires planning, human resources, financial resources. But this could be in strong states. But what's the question? What's the situation in fragile states? I
Yeah.
do you think it's going to take the same resources if they find it successful?
Yeah, I think it, one of our points in the book is that special operations are relative to the group. It's relative to the category. So, what a militant group like Islamic State or Hamas can resource for their special operations is quite different than, let's say, a criminal organization or mercenaries. Um, um, Proxies tend to be, because they're sponsored by external actors and directed by external actors, not just sponsored. They are usually much more highly resourced, and a lot of times with that resourcing will come military assistance and training by the sponsor. Let's say Hezbollah and their training of Iraqi groups in the previous wars in Iraq that allowed them to create special operations capabilities very quickly, and then that happens as you imagine. We didn't measure this, but I would imagine it happens more in either unstable and fragile states or in, Iraq is a very large and has lots of resources, but we saw a lot of special operation examples in Iraq in the 2006 to 2000, 14 time period, and that has to do a lot with the political and violent instability within the country. So I think it's not necessarily the size or the um, but also what's going on internally within the state that provides opportunities for very adaptive and creative opponents.
Yeah, I mean, if we stay with the terrorist organizations, Greg, you have been involved in deep research on ISIS, the Islamic State, um, and they have conducted many special ops. Uh, we see the image here, whether in Iraq and Syria. Um, what were the most surprising aspects of their operations?
Yeah,
What we might call like underappreciated aspects of their special ops, something that we need to look in a different way at.
sure. Um, I, you know, I, you and I have talked a lot about this in the past in our past collaborations, but
Yes.
Islamic State is just one of the most dynamic violent non-state actors I've ever come across, and studying, writing a book about non-state special operations, which is quite broad, many different types of actors, many different type of militant groups, and then looking at from a historical perspective. And we have example from the American Revolution with the Rangers supporting British operations. I'm sorry, the French and Indian Wars, uh, all the way through today, but it's still Islamic State, I think, that, and this is underappreciated about them, going to your question, in the sense that they're, normally looked at for governance, their interest in governance and their execution of governance. That's something that the ISIS files looked at and produced some, great scholarship on terrorism, suicide attacks. There very so many aspects of Islamic State have been looked at, but this aspect has not been looked at, and you know we my appreciation for what they're able to do comes as a former practitioner conducting counterinsurgency against them, in 2006 and seven, but also as a researcher. Our our interest in non-state special operations starts with Islamic State and this specific raid, the Haditha raid of 2012. This is at a time the United States is just a few months before has just withdrawn from Iraq. The group is considered to be, um, you know, just a kind of uh, hanging on after a fairly, strong defeat by the surge during the surge with the coalition and the Iraqi government, as well as the awakening, the Sahwa awakening in Anbar and other that spread to other places. But this is an example. One, it's very well documented in their clanging of the swords. Two, which was before their very viral clanging of the swords. Four, which was took place, I think, in mostly Mosul area. You probably remember that well. Um, but I was studying Islamic State at the time, working on my PhD dissertation, and I was quite shocked at their ability to produce this kind of operation which was kind of dismissed as a kind of a one-off. It's this they took over a town in the middle of the desert. What are they trying to do? No one really understood. But for me, it was quite a shock. And I partnered with Ian Rice here at the Naval Postgraduate School. He teaches the history of Special Operations Forces, and he was talking about his research, and I asked him. I said, "Well, how does this fit into what you talk about when you say special operations and special operations forces?" And we kind of looked at, the video, which is documented. It's a propaganda video that kind of lays out, the special operations from preparation all the way to post. And it's quite an exceptional, both propaganda piece, but also insight into not just the group, what it was trying to do, but most importantly, um, how they thought about executing special operations. The Haditha raid starts with a ruse. You can see him, and he's dressed as a Iraqi special forces, which allows them to enter the city in the first place without even being questioned. So this meets this McRaven criteria of surprise and achieving this relative superiority early on in an operation. Um, but it's the political messaging that's so important from this special operation. It sends a message to all of Anbar province that Islamic State is back. The United States is gone. The Islamic State is back. And that if they're going to continue to support the Iraqi government, that they're going to be in trouble. And their targets in this raid are just a few people, but they are Iraqi Sunnis that are part of the awakening, that are supporting the government. And the elimination of those is a message that we can get to you at any time, any place, and no amount of government forces can protect you. And that's what this special operation not only was trying to do, but more importantly, it's tied to larger campaign objectives. These larger objectives you're talking about from the operational and strategic level, because Islamic State uses this video as part of their breaking of the walls announcement of a new ramped up campaign that will lead them eventually, as they envisioned it at least, to the establishment of the caliphate in 2014. They can't know that, but this is part of their operational planning. So the special operation is kind of an inflection point in this campaign. And we saw this in other special operations in Ramadi, the Battle of Donkey Island 2007, which was not a success, but it was an attempt to short circuit the awakening at an early stage. And it could have changed the dynamics of the bandwagon awakening effect against Islamic State of Iraq in 2007. And then we saw it as well in the 2013 Abu Ghraib prison break, which is also their opportunity to transition from breaking of the walls to a new campaign, the Harvest of the Soldiers campaign in 2013. So they're using special operations to transition to higher levels of guerrilla warfare against the state. And we saw this in other groups. The Viet Cong embassy attack in Saigon in 1968, much like the Haditha raid, is part of a larger campaign, the Tet Offensive, but it's a very specific, very propaganda laden, and very integrated messaging that really almost overshadows other aspects of the campaign. So when going back to Islamic State, you just look at the planning and flawless execution of at least two of these special operations, um, and these operations helped us develop a framework that we then applied to lots of others.
Um, you mentioned that earlier, Greg, but can we compare between uh, those special operations of militants, but also of criminal networks? Like, um, how should the states prepare? What action should be taken? Uh, are we now facing a necessity and a need for a review of counterterrorism measures? Should we start thinking differently about counterterrorism and counter measures of criminal networks?
Um, I think it depends on the type of actor. Again, that's what we felt the typology was useful. Um, I think we do need to start thinking a little differently about these kind of groups. At the same time that we have these geopolitical um, rivalries and contests at the highest level, at state level, but very capable state levels. There's obviously there's either not a lot of bandwidth or even a deliberate kind of downplaying of these types of topics because we have bigger fish to fry, for lack of a better phrase. But what we're seeing and what we've always really seen with violent on-state actors is they use that lack of attention to kind of supercharge their own efforts. And I think every time that we look away from this kind of global threat obviously in different localized contexts, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Palestine or Gaza, whether it's Iraq and Syria, whether it's Africa, the Sahel, all across different violent groups there, or in the Philippines. They all have very very unique local contexts, but they also learn from each other. I think that's something that you talked about earlier. Is these groups learn from each other. They are inspired from each other, right? I haven't seen this analysis, but Hamas is what some observers talk about as their strategic shift from what they were trying to do previously with Israel versus a direct confrontation and the offensive that we saw on October 7th, and what trying to understand what they were trying to achieve. Um, we argued that they execute a special operation, um, that it was, from our test, which I have here, that it was quite different from what they normally did, which was usually rocket attacks into Israel, normally very localized, from Ashkelon south, that it had specialized tactical actions that were critical in breaching a very sophisticated Israeli defense along Gaza, and that the objective of this military attack, this series of specialized tactical actions, in this case, is quite widespread, was to have an outside strategic impact to change the discourse, to change the strategic dynamics between Israel and Hamas, but also in the larger region, right? I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to say that October 7th changed or at least frustrated attempts for normalization of relations between certain states in the Middle East, and that's what um, these actors can do. And one thing I teach my students here at the Naval Postgraduate School is, our leadership. Maybe a couple of weeks before October 7th, you have the National Security Advisor of the United States saying, "Hey, we've never seen the Middle East in a more better place for peace."
Mm.
And it's easy to get these things wrong when you have these violent non-state actors who are both quite capable and very motivated to kind of conduct these activities against states that are misinterpreting at best, or just kind of playing down the threat. I was in Israel a couple of weeks before the October 7th attack, and it wasn't that they didn't see Hamas as an enemy, a capable enemy. It was that they were very focused on Hezbollah in the north. They had moved lots of assets there, and they were ready to fight Hezbollah. So the timing from Hamas in that aspect and in other aspects was quite perceptive.
Yeah, it's true. It's true that it's true what you said. It's an accurate assessment. Like, but there's also a question. And when I look at non-state actors, and I look at the equipments, and when I look at the states, and also I look at the equipments. Of course, uh, states spend a lot on advancing their military capabilities. But the problem is, and especially in the special ops, especially in the effectiveness of these operations, I mean, do you agree or disagree that they might not need that much finance to prepare themselves with something that is already in the market, whether it's drones, whether it's secure communication, whether it's cyber capabilities. I mean, it is something that can be easily obtained now. I mean, what challenge does this bring? What challenges does the technology advancement bring to all of this equation?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's an important aspect. I mean, our conclusion from the research is that it's not just about technology, that it is much more about combinations, that using surprise and deception, which are obviously ancient principles of warfare. Um, in any of the special operations, it's always the idea that we think is the most important, right? Whether it's October 7th, whether it was the Haditha raid, whether it's Abu Ghraib prison breakout. I mean, or any of the other ones we studied. It starts with an idea that utilizes that surprise and deception. To be sure, we don't see specific technologies dominating, but um, let's just look at the Haditha raid, which I've already used. So I'll just they use it's 2012, so it's still it feels like it was the eternity ago, but they're using Google Earth to plan out and brief their operations. And for for us now, it seems like, yeah, of course they would, but then it was a capability that non-state actors did not have they did not have the ability uh, to to use anything other than rudimentary maps or their own knowledge of the terrain. And of course, they know the terrain very well. They probably had insiders from Haditha on the raid who helped lead them through a town that was very familiar to them. So these things don't rely on technology, but they did use satellite imagery. They did use night vision goggles in the Haditha raid. They are able to buy these on the market. They're able to completely and convincingly pass themselves off as Iraqi special forces because they're able to get these uniforms and stuff like that. And so in some ways it is the technology. In other operations like October 7th, they use technology very well. They use again satellite imagery to find vulnerabilities in military establishments in Israel where they can come in the back door, breach into the back door, and be into a military facility before the defenders know they're there. That's one example, but they also use unmanned capabilities like drones to defeat Israel's unmanned towers, machine gun
Yes.
towers so you're using unmanned against unmanned, and it just demonstrates what you're talking about, which in our day and age, due to a variety of aspects we talk about in the books and cite people like Audrey Kurth Cronin on Power to the People, the idea of the democratization of technology and how it's empowering violent non-state actors. That is a real thing. I think it's something that is going to continue in this trend, what we think is a trend in the embarrassment of states by these violent non-state actors who are much more capable now than they've ever been.
Um, Craig, how much of what happened? I think the three examples probably we focus on this, and then we move to the question of how are we going to deal with the future evolution of these special ops. We have seen three very specific examples where special ops here have contributed. For example, in Afghanistan, and you know this very well, Taliban has used the technique of small scale special ops for a very long time to exhaust the state. Sometimes the special ops they are not meant to happen all at once or to achieve a goal that immediate implication, but they have to do it from time to time in order to exhaust the state. ISIS did the same, and then for a very long time. Hamas did, as well as the very recent activities we have seen in Syria. But the question is, will we witness this type of evolution of special ops from the type of operations like Haditha one, small scale, but was meant to be symbolic, a political message, into special ops that in fragile states where the main purpose of that is overthrowing a government, because it also takes me to another question, like if these groups have shown these capabilities, are we in a situation where they might be even like accepted, like they can rule over, they are capable of ruling over their country, they might not pose a risk outside their territories. We can wait and see. I mean, this is a very dangerous trend that we are witnessing now. Do you
Yeah.
think that is the direction where we are going?
I do think so. It's one thing I really appreciated and learned a lot during the research. I mean, that's um, it's trying to understand the pattern of military activities and how that translates over to both political impact as well as the achievement of objectives. The one thing that's tough is that, a lot of the things you're describing in, let's say, Afghanistan or in Syria when HTS took over and their kind of lightning campaign. I mean, these are brilliant military campaigns that, at least in the HTS, I've not seen a really um, a great, and now I've seen great analysis about the events, but not necessarily on the military campaign itself. The idea, is one of the ideas that we found most powerful. Ian and I found most powerful in the research is the idea of non-state campaigning. Is the idea that the sophistication and the ability to put together military activities in time and space to achieve operational and strategic objectives. You can see the patterns. Um, and in fact, I've been studying Islamic State specifically, which I think hopefully gave us insights into some other non-state special operations. Um, but I had studied it for over a decade plus, including doing my dissertation on the group prior to 2014, and really missed the fact that they were using not just conducting non-state special operations, but how they were integrated into the campaigning, like I described before. And it was it took studying special operations and when and how they're used in larger campaigns like you're talking about, let's say in Afghanistan, um, to really punctuate, right? Um, the campaign, or to kind of highlight, to use for propaganda, to be leveraged. Those aspects are important. But there are other aspects. I think one thing the Taliban did do, which is something that we saw lots of other groups do as well. Let's see if I can find, yeah, this one right here. I'll just put militant groups up here because we have Haditha for large scale raids as one of our categories, but you see others like Manda Bay and Al Shabaab conducted in Kenya to destroy American drones that in a
Yes.
relatively unguarded, poorly guarded base in Kenya. So you see the ship captured by the Houthis, but prison breakouts, right? One thing the Taliban did well, that Islamic State did at Abu Ghraib, but the Irgun does in the Israeli independence wars in the Palestine Mandate in 1947 is break out their own experienced operatives from very highly guarded locations, which requires these kind of specialized operations. It has to be done very carefully, or your guys who are prisoners can be killed,
Yes.
right? If you do this poorly, um, we saw that in Syria in 2012, right? With a not very well resourced and not very well executed attempt to break Islamic State folks out of prison there. But you see them in quite other places, and the impact of that is the Islamic State never highlighted Abu Ghraib as a propaganda, which they could have, because it was absolutely, I think it's their most exceptional special operation. They were more intent in capturing their human capital, their experienced militants at the mid and high levels, and bringing them back in order to continue the offensive against the state. And arguably that's an inflection point. Abu Ghraib is an inflection point in 2013 that sets the stage for the operations in Mosul and in Nineveh, right?
Yes.
That allow Islamic State with their experienced fighters coming supercharging an already an insurgency that already has a lot of momentum in 2013, right? And that's just going to put them over the top. So it's the integration of these special operations into their normal kind of guerrilla warfare doctrine is what impressed me the most.
Um, I mean, Craig, you mentioned the prison break is an integral part of the special ops of the Islamic State. Um, before they attacked Mosul 2014, they had conducted multiple attacks on prisons.
Yeah.
But this brings the question now, especially with the changing dynamics in Syria. Is there a risk? Do you think that is something that is going to be a potential risk now to lead a special type of special ops for prison break? But
I
it's
mean,
also similar.
yeah.
Yeah, it's also similar to a question I got uh, from someone in the audience, Suzanne, I think, asking if something if a similar scenario in the Philippines is also possible, where ISIS affiliates might also start thinking in the direction of special ops, small scale or large scale.
Yeah, I mean, Marawi might be a good to the last question. The Marawi might be a good for one of our militant examples is the plunging attack. Mumbai is an example. The U.S. Embassy attack. Um, the takeover of Marawi as a city might be an example of that. We didn't look at that one specifically, but it could be an example of a plunging attack that then um, the attack on the prison in Mosul. I'm forgetting the name of the prison, but
Adush.
really, yeah, right. That's the one. That's not the first time they hit it. I think they hit it in
Yes,
2007 as well.
that's correct.
So I'm always like, prisons are the most neglected. This is a sidebar. Prisons are always the most neglected. You never have your top tier like security units on them. No one wants to be there. There's often a live and let live environment in the prison itself. And many of these prison breaks are actually inside outside breaks. Like everyone in the inside knows they're getting broken out, or specific populations. There's a conspiracy, guards are paid off, and then so there, it's quite an intricate intelligence and security operation. But it's certainly with 10,000 ISIS prisoners in north eastern Syria, guarded by with the United States pulling out and or pulling some of its forces out, and its partners looking for new partners. And HTS, the good thing is HTS knows the Islamic State threat better than maybe anyone else, for a lot of good reasons. But you could see those are the type of operations that change strategic dynamics very quickly, and that would change the dynamics for Islamic State, which I think largely in Iraq they're moribund, and in Syria they're still active, but compared to the heyday of a decade ago, they are nowhere. They're not even in the top 10 of insurgencies of Islamist insurgencies of Salafi jihadist
Mm.
insurgencies. They're not even in the top 10, and you need certainly the Islamic State, they've talked about it in Naba, but they're certainly focused on a great way to change the dynamic. You're losing and you want to get back into the fight is to conduct a special operations, and prison is just one example of that.
On the Greg, but before I ask you this question, we have probably around 10 minutes. If
Yep.
there are any questions, I encourage the audience to send them in the Q&A section. I've got another question in the chat.
Yep.
Craig, it says, how can states proactively counter violent non-state special operations instead of just reacting to them? How
Yeah.
can they get ahead of these threats?
I mean, that's an evergreen question, and I don't have a good answer. I don't have a good answer other than, be eternally vigilant, right? Like no one's eternally vigilant. The reason we can even find special operations is because somewhere people have not been vigilant, and non-state actors who this is what they do. They look for vulnerabilities, they look for opportunities. If they're dedicated, this gets back to the different types of non-state actors. Criminal groups they're so profit oriented
Yes.
that they relatively rarely do the special operations that we saw them do were more about creating monopolies. They're more about maximizing profits and conducting a sequence of operations that fit perfectly where they can establish a monopoly like the artichoke wars from the growers to the retail and
Mm.
use violence to enforce that monopoly. That was their special operation. And it's incredibly rare because most of the time they're just doing kind of very small scale, just the normal routines of what all of these, there's always a routine and a normalcy of each of these VNSAs. Um, so how, the only thing I could say is that, and this is a little selfish, is that one of the things we think is a value of the research is looking at it from the VNS, the violent non-state actor perspective, and privileging that for just a minute, that they have the ability to not just create specialized capability, even though they don't have, almost all of them do not have a dedicated special operations force, right? That's the disconnect that we see a lot is, well, because they don't have soft like we do, they don't conduct special operations. Like, no, they would ad hoc these special operations with specially trained forces that they then disbanded and sent back to doing what they were doing before because they can't resource full-time special operations. If they did, we would hunt them down and kill them. So they
Yeah.
have to still operate within their kind of their modus operandi. But just the fact that no one's ever called 9/11 a special operation. Yes, it is a terrorist attack. It killed civilians, it killed non-combatants, and it did it for political reasons. It's the definition of terrorism. But we argue it's also a special operation because it's different from what Al Qaeda had done in the past, entirely different. It was quite different from what any group had actually done. It exposed that vulnerability, it created this outsized impact, and it was not the most specialized tactic, but they were able to defeat at that time, TSA kind of procedures. So the ability to kind of comprehend that these folks have the ability to kind of think operationally and to put these things together in larger campaigns, and that these aren't just one-offs, that these aren't just like, oh, they got lucky, right? The old IRA adage, you have to be good all the time, we just have to be lucky once for our terror attack to work. That gives us a false, I think, impression of what the true capabilities of violent non-state actors is.
Is this is a question that comes to my mind. Um, the the type of, I mean, based on your expertise in national security, Craig. I mean, prisons are a target to these special ops, smaller scale attacks here and there. But what other targets might be on the mind of this type of special operations? I mean, what is the attractiveness of these operations? Like, do they seek something symbolic? Do they seek something that is more symbolic on a local level, symbolic on a global level? It's like, are these dynamics changing when we are talking about non-state special ops?
I I mean, we don't. I mean, it kind of goes back to what Colin Gray said, the motives behind doing a special operations versus what, you can always invest the resources that you have as a non-state actor or even as a state into the things that you're always doing. A conventional military, conventional guerrilla warfare. If you're a non-state actor, that's conventional to you, right? It's actually, more, it's more, large scale activities that's unconventional to a non-state actor, right? So it's the opposite. Stephen Biddle wrote a good book on this on non-state warfare. It's quite different, but um, it is difficult for us to see uh, what these folks are trying to do. But going back to Colin Gray, a lot of times it is about embarrassing and humiliating the stronger power in order to achieve some strategic effect. And so that logic works for them, and it's hard for us to see that logic because Carbable PJCC, they were trying to kidnap some Americans to hold them hostage to trade for other of their comrades. Well, actually, they were doing it on behest of Hezbollah to I'm sorry, on behalf of Iranians Quds Force.
Mm.
Sorry, they had a Lebanese Hezbollah advisor, but they were doing it to possibly exchange prisoners between American hostages for the Iranian Quds Force operatives that were captured by Americans in Iraq at the time. So when we do these kind of events like capture Quds Force, all of a sudden in 2007, we even had the intelligence that they were going to try to take Americans and keep them as hostages. What they did was create a special operations capability to do a hostage snatch on very capable American soldiers in a position in Karbala. And so that's just an example of a special operation, and then how we missed the clues. Obviously, the Israelis missed clues on October 7th, but on almost every one, the bombing in Beirut in the 1983. There's always the intelligence and the clues, but it's largely dismissed as like, but why would they do that, right? Well, it's because they also think operationally, strategically, and campaign.
Yes. I mean, the question of non-state actors, special operations. If you go to the proxy groups, Craig, because
Yeah.
my question is actually related to that, is that are these special ops possible without state sponsorship?
In the proxy, I mean, state generally yes, because militant groups do that. We found evidence of all. I was suspect that criminal groups did special operations, but we did it, and based off of the definition, we found that did happen. We have examples of mercenary special operations, but proxy groups we found to be actually the most dangerous because they're supercharged by the sponsor. They're directed by the sponsor. Like, for
Yes.
example, the Karbala PJCC attack that I mentioned really spelled the end for Assad al-Haq, at least for a while, because the United States went completely, you know, absolutely went after them and put them all in prison. So they were quite, and probably, supercharged their rivals. So it wasn't good for them, but it's what the Iranians wanted, and the Iranians were paying for it. They're the ones who trained them, and they kind of walked them through. They had a Lebanese Hezbollah advisor on the ground with their rehearsals and quite possibly on the mission itself, right? And so it really shortens the time between their ability, and that's something I think with great power competition. That's another aspect is when I want to do something to my great power enemy, or I can supercharge a non-state group that then conduct a special operation to then really humiliate you or affect the larger strategic and political landscape.
Craig, I would like to thank you very much for all these insights. And once again, congratulations on publishing this very important book. We look forward, myself looking forward really to read that book. Uh, but probably in less than a minute, like just technical information, when it's going to be published, how people can get it.
It'll be published in July. We've already, it's in the publication process, and hopefully they'll have it's a very expensive academic book, but it should have a paperback out sometime in the future. I'm not sure when. But yeah, it's out in July, and we will produce. I'll produce a. I've talked to you about producing a kind of a summary article for the program on extremism that should be out, soon with us. That'll kind of give the some of the down and dirty before this book is published, for those who can't spend like hundreds of dollars on academic books.
Thank you again, Craig. The link to the book is in the chat. Everyone is interested can find it. This session has been recorded. You can find it on Program on Extremism at GW, and a brief article will be published soon that leads to more insights on the book. Once again, thank you, Craig Whiteside, for this very insightful discussion. This was Omar Mohammed, and this was our session on non-state special operations.